Hey everybody, welcome back to Mixing Music Analog and mixingmusicanalog.com, and here on my YouTube channel, and here's another installment of subscriber Q&A where I gather up all your questions in email, Facebook, and YouTube. Questions that come in multiple times, and now I'm going to try to answer them for you in these videos. So if you want one of your questions answered and you have any question about gear and hybrid mixing or analog mixing and the workflow and all that stuff, go ahead and leave your comments or your questions below in the comments box, because I do read them and I do gather them up, and you'll have your question answered in an upcoming episode. So make sure you like, share, subscribe, go out to mixingmusicanalog.com if you want to learn more about my mixing services, and if you're into the hybrid mixing workflow and you have some hardware incorporated in your project studio, I have a brand new mixing course. You can check the link in the description box below called Hybrid Mixing, and we're going to have a series of those over the next 18 months. Make sure you click the link in the description box below, check it out. You'll really dig it. It's got 5 camera angles, you get audio files, we mix the song together from start to finish, and you're really gonna love it. It's like over 6 hours long. It's the most comprehensive mixing course I've ever created. Check the link in the description box. You'll go out to homerecordingmadeeasy.com and pick up Hybrid Mixing. Okay, so got 3 questions we're gonna try to answer in today's episode. These questions get asked multiple times. I'm just going to tell you the last person's name that wrote in. But I can assure you these get asked quite a bit. So question number 1 comes in from Patrick 1954. All right, Patrick, here we go. He asked, Dave, do you use any sort of mixing template when working analog? Do you have a specific settings on certain pieces of gear that never change to help speed up your workflow? That's a good question, Patrick. Basically, the answer to that question is no. So I don't use, I have a standard template in my DAW that I use that has all my inputs all of my inputs for printing stems and stuff back in, and a couple of different plugins that I use every single mix on my print track in Studio One. But outside of that, everything else is done on a session by session basis. When I first started working analog, I thought I was going to be able to have some kind of set it and forget it stuff, whether it be on the board or in the rack or in the DAW template. And what I found was, because every session is completely unique, I spent more time manipulating that template, and it took a lot longer than just starting from scratch. So basically what I do, Patrick, is I at the end of every mix, I zero out all the EQs, I pull all the faders down, all the pans go back to the center. I unpatch every piece of gear that I used in that particular session, except for my master bus, which is my SSL Fusion that goes into my Neve 542 Portico tape emulators, and then go to the my master bus EQ. Those stay hard patched, but all the settings on the EQ go completely flat. The Fusion usually has a standard set of settings that kind of stay, like that all the time, and I'll tweak it per mix. And the same thing with the Neve 542. So those have some settings that are kind of set it and forget it, but everything else completely from scratch. I found that to be the most efficient way to do it, especially after I get everything prepped in my DAW and I start routing things out to the console. Everything changes. So I start from scratch, and I just like that. And again, if you take my hybrid mixing course, you'll see as part of that course, 2 video modules in that course, I take you through my whole setup process. How long it takes to set it up. I have a checklist, a process checklist that I go through every single mix, and how I actually set up a mix. So if you really want to learn about that, go check out my hybrid mixing course. Again, link in the description box below. But yeah, no, I pretty much start from scratch. And I just like that. Some guys will have, kind of some things that are templated out, but I really don't, because I find it's faster to start from scratch. So I hope that answers your question. Good, that's a good question, great question. Okay, the next question comes in from Brian A. Last name starts with an A, okay. And he asks, hey Dave, what is your typical mix session workflow? Do you use an assistant to do the session prep before mixing the song, or do you prep and mix the song at the same time? That's an excellent question, and I've been asked that now 3 times, 2 or 3 times, and that's why I've included it in this episode. My workflow, well, number 1, I don't have an assistant that preps all my sessions. I considered it at one time, But honestly, I'm such a stickler for things to be done in a very particular way that a few times I looked for assistance, and just to find good quality people today is very, very difficult. I know they're out there, but I'm not someone who's been able to find someone that can live up to Uncle Dave's standards of work, which is, you know, I'm pretty particular about the way I want things done, and I'm a pretty hands-on control freak when it comes to that stuff. So I don't have an assistant that does that. I'm busy, but I'm not so busy that I need somebody to do that. Maybe at one point, if I found the right assistant, the person with the right work ethic, maybe I would try somebody out. But as it sits right now, no, I don't have an assistant to prep my stuff. I prep it all myself. And again, the hybrid mixing course shows you how I do that. As far as do I prep the song and then mix it at the same time? Typically, if at all possible, no. I think of the mixing process as really two different phases. Phase one is setup and housekeeping and more technical stuff as far as cleaning tracks and tuning vocals and doing all that stuff and getting all the session ready to come out to the console. And once it comes to the console, it's like my brain goes to the creative mode where now we're mixing and we're not fixing. And during that setup process, you end up listening to the song quite a bit and listening to things and listening from an analytical point of view that when I want to get ready to go to the creative mode and mix, I'd like to have a little bit of a break. So whenever I'm mixing for someone, let's say I'm mixing a 3-song EP or a 4-song EP, what I'll do is in one day, I'll go through each one of those sessions, I'll prep them all, and I'll get them ready to be routed out to the console. And I'll do that for songs 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when I go to mix, I'll go back to the first song and mix that song first. So if the last song I prepped was song 4, the first song I'm going to mix is going to be song 1. I try to disconnect myself as much as possible from the mix setup and mix prep to the actual mixing. So I don't get overly familiar with the song, the song doesn't wear on me, and I could hear it with a fresh set of ears and a fresh brain that's kind of thinking in a different way, more creative, and I can work a lot faster that way. Now, that doesn't always happen, because if there's deadlines and timelines and the schedule doesn't allow for that based on the artist's needs and such, sometimes I'll prep it and then mix it. I'll try to take a 2 or 3 hour break and then mix it that evening, set it up in the morning, mix it in the evening, stuff like that. But where at all possible, I like to give myself at least a day, if I can, from the time that I've set it up and it's ready to be done, mixed, to when we actually start mixing. That's typically what I try to do. That's a great question, Brian. And no, I don't have an assistant. Don't have an assistant. Not at this time anyway. Hope that answers your question. Okay, the next question comes in. Well, there was no name on this email. I don't know why. Their email address was weird and I couldn't figure it out. But anyway, I might have been asked this more than once. They asked me, how many sets of speakers do I check my mixes on? So currently, I use 2 sets of speakers. I have my main speakers here, which are my Focal twins with the Focal subwoofer. That's where I do 80% of the mixing, 90% of the mixing. And then on the console, I can have up to 3 sets of speakers, but I just flip it over to my Bluetooth speaker. It's up in the rack there. You might not be able to see it. It's just a Bose mono Bluetooth speaker that I use as well that has a little bit of an enhanced bass, but it's mono, which is great. And so I'll check it there. And then sometimes I'll do maybe one more final check. I'll plug in my headphones into the console and use as headphones. And that's really it. Prior to doing, if you have not seen, by the way, I did a couple of videos on my room correction solution that I have here called the Trin-Off system. Prior to the Trin-Off, before I had the room correction in place, I was using even more speakers. I was using a pair of Avitone speakers. I was using a pair of earbuds. I was using tons of stuff, 5 or 6 different sources. But ever since I got my Trin-Off installed and I've dialed in my room, my mixes translate so much better now. And I can mix so much faster that I can trust what I'm hearing coming out of the Focals 100%. And therefore, I really don't need to check them on too many sources. So right now, I'm really only checking them on 2 sets of speakers, Focals and the Bluetooth. And then, as I said, as a 3rd set, I'll throw my headphones on quickly just to check them. But that's really it. That's really it. I don't need to check them on multiple pairs of speakers anymore. And a lot of that has to do with, again, because I have the room dialed in, both with acoustic treatment and then again, my Trin-Off room correction solution really made the biggest difference. And again, you can check the archive there. I have a playlist on Trinoff. You can go check it out. You'll know what I'm talking about. But that's a good question. So just 2 sets of speakers and a pair of headphones. Okay, last question for this episode here. And again, this has been asked by so many people that I don't even have a name of who asked last. I get asked this all the time, so I'm including it in this episode. So if you wrote this in at one point, your question's getting answered. Okay, and I've answered this in other videos as part of other topics, but here we go. I'm looking to purchase my first piece of outboard gear. What recommendations do you have? Should I get a compressor, an EQ? Do I get a stereo unit for the master bus? Any help is greatly appreciated. Well, thank you so much to all the people that have asked me that question over the last 2 years. Here's what I tell everyone when you're starting with getting hardware, you want to add a piece of gear. Figure out what your budget is, start at the master bus and work your way back, right? So the first thing I'll say to people is get something on your 2 bus. Something either like a stereo compressor EQ combo box, or a compressor and an EQ, 2 separate units, or something even like an SSL Fusion, like a color box, things that have a few different modules in there. The Fusion has a vintage drive, it has a distortion circuit, it's got a shelving EQ, it's got a transformer circuit, it's got a stereo imager or a stereo widener. The master bus is where you're going to get the most audible bang for buck, and that's where I would start, okay? I would start there. So you can either start with a compressor EQ or something like a Fusion, or maybe both. Get your master bus dialed in. Once you've done that and you're ready to go to the next step, then I would say go back to the group channels or the buses, right? So let's say you have, like on my console here, I have 8 stereo buses, but let's say you always have a drum bus in your setup. Say you typically route your drums to a drum bus and you'll put some compression or something on in the box. And I would start at the buses. Maybe you get yourself, again, a good drum bus compressor, or a second stereo compressor that you can use on drums. Work on the buses next. That's what I would say, either with EQ or compression. Then from there, you can work your way backwards into individual channels if you wanted to do that. Or instead of going to individual channels with hardware, maybe that's when you're looking at an analog mixer of some kind, whether it's a desktop model or even a full-length console. But I would say start at the master bus and work your way backwards. Now, as far as EQs or compressors outside of the master, I would always, for me personally, I hear the biggest difference between plugins and hardware. The biggest improvement is usually in the compressors. EQ, the gap is a lot closer. So in other words, if you're starting off and you have a limited budget, which most of us do, maybe you're looking at a master bus EQ, or excuse me, a master bus compressor, and maybe you'll use a master bus EQ in the box for now with a plugin, okay? The compressors tend to have a much more 3D type of a sound than plugins in most cases. And again, we've done many shootouts here on the channel, hardware versus the plugin counterparts, and I have yet to do one of those shootouts where I thought the plugin was up to par with the hardware, and I have yet to find one where it was better than the hardware. Now on the EQ, again, that gap is a lot closer, so I would start with compressors. Even saturation, again, the SSL Fusion, I'm using that as an example because I have one. We shot that out against the plugin. The hardware sounds better to me. It does. There's a bigger difference there. The plugins sound great, but they don't sound quite like the hardware. So if you're choosing between EQs or compressors, I would say for hardware, start with the compressors. And then you can always get yourself a master bus EQ down the road. Again, it really depends on your budget, and you can start off small and you can scale it. And that's the great thing when you're working with hardware and the analog or the hybrid workflow is you can scale it. And then you can, start to lean a little less on your plugins as you get good quality pieces of gear. But even in this rig, even though with all the hardware that I have, I still use a handful of plugins on every single session. And when I first started working in this workflow, I worked with way more plugins than I do now. And over time, as I found which pieces and hardware I felt sounded better than the plugins, I would swap out the plugin for hardware. But the answer to your question, for everyone that it's written in, start on the master bus, work your way backwards, and I wouldn't worry about the quantity of pieces of hardware you have. More so, you want to get good quality gear as well. We get asked this a lot, and I think in an upcoming episode we get asked about The differences between the real hardware and the knockoff by a company that can make the same piece of hardware for 1/3 the price. I would do your research and I try to stay away from that. I always tell people when you're getting into hardware, try to, if at all possible, buy good quality pieces. The name brands that you all know and love, because those will also retain their resale value if down the road you want to sell them. For example, if you buy a piece by SSL or a piece by API or a piece of gear by Neve, those three, and there's many others, but those are the big three most people know. You're not going to lose your shirt on any one of those pieces of gear. They don't make garbage gear. I don't care if it's an EQ, a compressor, a transient designer, whatever. Those three companies in this example make fantastic pieces of gear. And so if you buy good quality gear, number one, it's typically going to sound better. It's going to be built to last. It's going to last you a lifetime. And also, if you ever decide to flip it or try something new, it's going to retain its value. When you buy these offshoot brands, some of them are really good. Some of them are not so great. And even though the gear looks the same and it may function the same, it's not really the same. In most cases, there are some exceptions to that, but in most cases I found that to be true. So save up your money and try to buy a good quality piece, especially if you're gonna buy, like we were talking about, something like a master bus compressor. Don't buy a $200 master bus hardware compressor. Don't waste your money, use a plugin. Buy yourself a good quality piece of gear, because you in the long run, you're gonna enjoy it a lot more and you're gonna realize the benefits of some hardware over plugins when you buy good quality stuff. So that is it for this episode of our subscriber Q&A. Again, make sure you leave your questions below and I'll get it into a future episode. If you want to know anything about what I do here, feel free to ask. Again, go out to mixingmusicanalog.com. Make sure you check out the hybrid mixing course, links in the description box below. And lastly, like, share, and subscribe. And until the next Q&A episode, I've been Dave with mixingmusicanalog.com, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care, everybody.